Three nations. One coordinated strike. Billions in resources seized overnight. The Sahel just rewrote the rules of African economics, and the shockwaves are still rippling across global markets. Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger didn't just nationalize mines. They declared economic independence from a system that has extracted African wealth for generations. This is about the future of African self-determination, and why the world's most powerful nations are scrambling to respond to what many are calling the continent's boldest act of resource sovereignty in decades. It began in Ouagadougou, where Burkina Faso's transitional government signed an emergency decree nationalizing key gold mines previously controlled by Canada's Endeavour Mining. But this move was unprecedented. The decree mandated that all gold refining and processing must now happen within Burkina Faso's borders, breaking decades of colonial economic patterns. Days later, Mali's transitional government delivered its own economic thunderbolt from Bamako. Officials announced they had quietly increased the state's mandatory ownership share in all mining ventures from a measly 10% to a robust 30%. And this wasn't just for new projects. This policy applied retroactively to existing operations, forcing global mining giant Barrick Gold into frantic negotiations overnight. But Mali wasn't finished. Simultaneously, they announced they were pursuing nearly $1 billion in back taxes and royalties from foreign operators. $1 billion that should have been circulating in Mali's economy, building schools, hospitals, and infrastructure, instead of padding the profit margins of multinational corporations. Mali's leadership framed this not as retaliation, but as economic justice, a term that resonates deeply when you consider that Mali has been sitting on some of the world's richest gold deposits, while its people struggle with poverty and underdevelopment. Then came Niger's masterstroke. In a move that sent shockwaves through European energy markets, Niger canceled its long-standing uranium contract with French nuclear giant Orano and suspended multiple foreign mining licenses. This wasn't a gradual policy shift. This was a swift, deliberate realignment away from the very colonial power structures that have dominated the Sahel for over a century. Niger's uranium has been powering French nuclear plants for decades, making this West African nation strategically crucial to European energy security, despite its modest overall economy. By pivoting toward partnerships with Russia and Iran, Niger signaled that the era of automatic deference to former colonial powers is over. The international reaction was immediate and telling. Gold prices spiked as traders scrambled to understand supply chain implications. European energy analysts began warning of potential uranium shortages. Mining stocks in London and Toronto tumbled as investors realized the old playbook no longer applied. Western diplomatic responses were sharp, with some officials calling these measures illegal seizures and warning of economic isolation. But here's what's crucial to understand. Inside Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, the tone was entirely different. Streets in Ouagadougou and Bamako erupted in celebration. Citizens who had watched foreign companies extract billions from their soil while they remained poor finally saw their governments taking decisive action. Posters appeared overnight reading, "Our uranium, our future, and African gold for African progress." This wasn't just policy change. This was a psychological breakthrough for millions of Africans who had been told for generations that foreign management was necessary for their own resources. To understand why these moves represent such a seismic shift, we need to examine the historical foundation they're built upon. For over half a century, multinational corporations dominated the Sahel's mining landscape through colonial-era extraction patterns. Gold and uranium projects were controlled by foreign firms with minimal local ownership, operating under contracts with generous tax breaks and profit repatriation rights, while the bulk of profits flowed overseas. The political upheavals that swept through Mali in 2020, Burkina Faso in 2022, and Niger in 2023 created a unique historical opening. When military governments took power in these nations, they inherited not just political crises, but collapsing relationships with Western allies who had been the primary beneficiaries of the old resource extraction model. Sanctions were imposed, aid was suspended, and military cooperation was scaled back, especially after French troops were expelled from the region. Faced with shrinking budgets and mounting public pressure to deliver tangible results, these new governments identified control of natural resources as their most direct path to economic independence. But there's a deeper ideological dimension to these moves that goes beyond immediate economic necessity. These military governments are embracing narratives that blend African nationalism, Pan-Africanism, and anti-colonial sentiment in ways that resonate powerfully with citizens who have lived through decades of resource extraction without proportional benefit. Pan-Africanist intellectuals and activists have long argued that true African independence requires economic sovereignty, the ability to control and benefit from the continent's natural wealth. Public rallies across the Sahel now feature slogans like "Our gold, our power," and "No more colonial chains," capturing a sentiment that extends far beyond these three nations. This ideological shift has practical implications. Western donors and financial institutions once played outsized roles in stabilizing Sahel economies through budgetary support and development projects. That funding has largely disappeared, withdrawn in response to military coups and concerns about democratic backsliding. To fill this gap, Sahel leaders are betting on resource wealth as an alternative revenue stream, one they can directly control and channel into state priorities like military modernization, infrastructure development, and social programs that build domestic legitimacy. There's also a crucial security dimension that often gets overlooked in Western analysis. In a region where insurgent groups control vast rural territories, gold and uranium aren't just economic assets, they're strategic ones. Unregulated artisanal gold mining has long provided financing for armed groups, creating parallel economies outside state control. By taking over large-scale industrial mining operations, governments hope to exert greater influence over production and theoretically cut off funding sources for insurgencies. Whether this strategy will succeed remains to be seen, but it represents a significant shift from the previous approach of relying on foreign military intervention to address security challenges. To grasp why these resource takeovers represent such a fundamental shift in African economic strategy, we need to understand what gold and uranium actually mean for the Sahel's economy, not just in raw numbers, but in how they shape livelihoods, state power, and regional influence. Gold is the economic backbone of Mali and Burkina Faso, accounting for over 2/3 of Mali's foreign exchange earnings, and nearly half of Burkina Faso's fiscal revenue. This wealth penetrates deep into society, supporting hundreds of thousands of miners and entire rural communities. But alongside formal industrial mines, extensive informal operations have flourished, using rudimentary techniques under dangerous conditions. Many of these sites have become taxation points for armed groups who use mining revenues to purchase weapons. This dual reality explains why state control represents more than profit. It's about legitimacy and security. By moving toward domestic refining and tighter regulation, governments are attempting to formalize the sector and capture more value internally. A domestically refined gold bar symbolizes independence from foreign-controlled supply chains. Uranium adds another crucial dimension, particularly in Niger's case. For decades, Niger's uranium powered French nuclear plants, creating dependency on French companies like Orano and vulnerability to price fluctuations. By canceling Orano's contracts and negotiating with Russia and Iran, Niger signals a fundamental shift away from colonial-era relationships. But uranium presents unique challenges. It requires specialized technology often beyond individual developing nations' capacity, making Niger's pivot fundamentally geopolitical. The stakes couldn't be higher because these resources directly affect fiscal survival. With foreign aid dramatically reduced following military coups, resource exports now represent the primary hard currency lifeline. Any disruption can cascade throughout society. What's fundamentally changing is the vision of how resources should function. The goal is no longer just generating budget revenue, but creating linkages with domestic industries, from refining to manufacturing. If successful, this could shift these nations from raw material suppliers to value-added industry participants. The Sahel's resource revolution has triggered a fundamental realignment of international partnerships that extends far beyond mining contracts. For decades, France, Canada, and other Western powers dominated both resource extraction and security arrangements across Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger. But as these governments reclaimed their mineral wealth, they simultaneously began rethinking their entire approach to international relations. This shift became clear when Niger ended its uranium agreement with French giant Orano and immediately opened discussions with Russia and Iran. Burkina Faso's refining initiatives attracted Chinese and Turkish technical expertise, while Mali welcomed Russian state-linked companies willing to accept higher political risks. This isn't simply economics, it's geopolitics in motion. Western mining companies previously operated with diplomatic and military backing. When French forces were expelled and aid frozen, alternative powers quickly filled the vacuum with partnerships unconditioned on democratic reforms. Russia provides both investment and security guarantees through state-backed ventures and private contractors, upgrading refineries and training mine security personnel. China focuses on infrastructure, roads, processing facilities, and renewable energy systems, integrating Sahel resources into belt and road corridors. Turkey offers versatile partnerships in construction, logistics, and mining technology, operating flexibly in specialized niches like gold refining equipment. These partnerships aren't without controversy. Western governments warn that pivoting toward Russia, China, and Iran could create new dependencies with less transparency and oversight. However, Sahelian leaders argue these relationships offer genuine choice and negotiating strength. The Alliance of Sahel States now coordinates resource policy, negotiating joint ventures and exploring shared currencies to protect revenues from foreign exchange volatility. Whether these partnerships deliver genuine independence or simply replace old dependencies with new ones will determine not just these nations' futures, but global resource politics. The Sahel's bold embrace of resource nationalism has created a historic inflection point that could either catalyze transformative economic development or precipitate deeper instability. The path forward presents both unprecedented opportunities and significant risks that will shape not only these three nations, but potentially influence resource politics across the entire African continent. The opportunities for transformation are substantial if implemented effectively. Domestic gold refining could support downstream industries from jewelry to electronics. Mali's increased state ownership could dramatically boost development financing. Niger's uranium realignment opens possibilities for nuclear technology partnerships beyond raw exports. If successful, this could demonstrate a viable alternative to colonial economic patterns, encouraging other African nations to rethink their resource contracts and pursue local value addition. However, significant risks accompany these opportunities. Sudden nationalizations have rattled global markets, prompting many investors to reconsider African projects. Without international capital and technical expertise, scaling complex operations, particularly uranium mining requiring advanced technology, may prove more challenging than anticipated. State-run enterprises across Africa have mixed records, often plagued by corruption and inefficiency. Without institutional reforms, nationalized resource revenues could be mismanaged or diverted rather than supporting development. Security challenges add complexity. Many mining regions remain contested by insurgent groups using gold to finance operations. If insurgents retaliate by targeting infrastructure, resource nationalism could trigger escalated violence and disrupt production. The geopolitical gamble carries long-term consequences. By aligning with Russia, China, Iran, and Turkey, the Sahel risks permanently alienating Western partners who historically provided development funding and diplomatic support. While partnership diversification offers strategic flexibility, it may deepen global polarization. For ordinary citizens who celebrated these seizures, the stakes are personal. Success could deliver employment, infrastructure, and national pride. But failure, if revenues dry up, projects stall, or violence escalates, could bring new hardship to populations currently celebrating this transformation. The Sahel has taken an undeniably bold leap that challenges decades of economic orthodoxy and established geopolitical alignments. Whether this leap lands on solid ground or slips into deeper instability depends entirely on what happens next. Building competent state institutions, securing mining zones effectively, and ensuring that resource wealth genuinely benefits ordinary people rather than simply changing which elites capture the benefits. The Sahel's resource revolution represents far more than three nations changing their mining policies. This coordinated action signals a potential paradigm shift in how African countries relate to global markets, international partners, and most importantly, their own natural endowments. For decades, African leaders have spoken about economic transformation and resource sovereignty, but few have taken actions as comprehensive as what we've witnessed in the Sahel. These nations have demonstrated that fundamental restructuring is possible even under international pressure. The ripple effects are visible across the continent. Other mineral-rich African nations are evaluating whether similar approaches might serve their development objectives. If the Sahel succeeds in building sustainable industries while maintaining stability, it could inspire continental resource nationalism. The formation of the Alliance of Sahel States also suggests possibilities for greater African economic integration based on shared sovereignty principles rather than external dependency relationships. When African nations coordinate resource policies and potentially develop shared currencies or trade mechanisms, it represents a step toward the kind of continental integration that Pan-Africanist thinkers have advocated for generations. However, success is far from guaranteed, and failure could have equally significant continental implications. If the Sahel experiment leads to economic decline, increased instability, or authoritarian consolidation, it might discourage other African nations from pursuing similar paths and reinforce arguments that African countries need external management of their resources. The Sahel's pivot toward Russia, China, and other non-Western powers reflects a broader African trend of diversifying international relationships. This multipolar approach offers more options and better negotiating positions, but requires sophisticated management to avoid replacing old dependencies with new ones. For young Africans who have grown up hearing about resource wealth that never translated into prosperity, the Sahel represents both inspiration and a test case. Success could catalyze new African leadership focused on economic sovereignty and continental development. Perhaps most importantly, the Sahel situation represents a fundamental question about African agency in the global economy. These nations are making their own decisions about their own resources based on their own priorities, an assertion of agency significant regardless of ultimate outcomes. One thing is absolutely certain as we watch this historic transformation unfold: the rest of the world is paying attention. What happens in Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger over the coming months and years will influence debates about resource sovereignty, global supply chains, and the future of African self-determination far beyond the Sahel region. These three nations have chosen to write their own economic story, rather than accepting the chapters that others would write for them. They've demonstrated that even small, landlocked African countries can coordinate policies that force global markets and major powers to recalculate their strategies. The questions that remain are profound. Will reclaiming resources finally deliver the independence and prosperity that the Sahel seeks? Can state-controlled mining operations match the efficiency and production levels of multinational corporations while delivering greater benefits to local populations? Will new partnerships with Russia, China, and other emerging powers prove more beneficial than the Western relationships they're replacing? Most importantly for every African watching this video, is this the beginning of a continent-wide resource revolution that could transform Africa's position in the global economy? Or are we witnessing the start of new conflicts and instabilities that could set back African development? The Sahel has made its choice. The results will shape not just the future of West Africa, but potentially the trajectory of the entire continent's relationship with the global economy. The revolution has begun. Now comes the hard work of making it succeed. What do you think? Are Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger pioneering a new model for African economic independence? Or are they taking dangerous risks that could backfire? Have you seen similar resource nationalism movements in other parts of Africa that we should be covering? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. We read every single one, and they help shape our future content. If this analysis opened your eyes to new perspectives on African economics and sovereignty, smash that like button and share this video with others who need to understand what's really happening in the Sahel. And if you want to stay informed about the African stories that mainstream media often ignores or misunderstands, subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell. We're committed to bringing you in-depth analysis of African culture, history, politics, and the evidence of how our continent continues to shape global affairs. The Sahel's resource revolution is just the beginning. Stay tuned for more stories about Africa rising on its own terms.